He said something to the effect of, today's India doesn't send dossiers to other countries to request assistance. Today's India will kill our enemies in their homes. Are you aware that that statement was made publicly by the Prime Minister?
That was a public statement that I am aware of.
To create a perception of an unsafe environment targeting the South Asian community in Canada. Do you recall that?
Yes.
A clear policy decision that was authorized and directed by responsible members of the government of India to orchestrate this violence. Is that fair?
I think that is a question that actually we have been repeatedly asking the government of India to assist us on.
Coalition. You spoke to Commission Council earlier about this intricate network of Canada-based Indian diplomats, senior government officials in India, and then the Lawrence Bishnoi gang, and who went on and engaged in violence in Canada. So before we move into some of the more substantive issues, I just want to clarify and confirm a couple of facts for the record. You spoke about a number of ways that diplomats covertly and illegally collected information on individuals in Canada, including threatening to revoke visas. Some of the information that was collected by diplomats was also done by coercion, including threats of violence against family members in India, correct?
I am very aware that there is an ongoing RCMP investigation and indeed trials and court cases on these issues. So I really would be hesitant to venture much further than I already have in which what I was saying was pretty much repeating what the RCMP announced on Monday. I wouldn't want to go further in characterizing things that are questions better asked of the RCMP.
Sure, that's totally fair. So the RCMP's press release and its comments at the press conference stated that organized crime was used to execute the violent activities to create a perception of an unsafe environment targeting the South Asian community in Canada. Do you recall that?
Yes.
So I think you would agree that this is quite an alarming and intrusive attack on Canada. So this goes beyond simple disinformation and amplifying narratives in the media that Canada is unsafe. These individuals and government officials actually orchestrated violence to make people feel unsafe and come to that conclusion. Is that fair?
I'd actually say there seem to be two goals in this. One is, yes, to make Canadians, particularly South Asian Canadians, feel less safe here in their own country. But secondly is actually to help prove a point that the Indian government has been trying to make about Canada for quite some time, that we are a country that doesn't take seriously violence or terrorism or incitements to hatred, which is entirely false, but failing an ability to point out how Canada has been supposedly failing to prevent violence, it seems like folks within the Indian government have decided to create violence and unlawfulness in Canada as a way of demonstrating the point that they are trying to make, that there is violence and unlawfulness in Canada. And I think that is exceptionally egregious as an approach to a neighboring sovereign democracy.
So you also indicated to Commission Council earlier that the diplomats were passing information to officials at the highest level of the Indian government, who then would pass on the information to the criminal gangs to orchestrate the violence. So given that reality, this was not just a rogue operation of a few individuals that went off track. At some level, in some form, there was a clear policy decision that was authorized and directed by responsible members of the government of India to orchestrate this violence. Is that fair?
I think that is an extremely important question. And that is a question that actually we have been repeatedly asking the government of India to assist us on. and to get to the bottom of. The question of whether it is or could be rogue elements within the government, or whether it was a more systematic endeavor for the government of India, is exactly the kind of thing that for investigators here on the ground in Canada, it is somewhat removed from being able to uncover the internal machinations of the Indian government, of who went wrong or who did this or who did that. That's why from the very beginning, we have been asking for India, the Indian government, to take these allegations seriously and proceed with their own investigations and work with us on figuring out exactly how these egregious violations of Canadian sovereignty actually happened.
Are you aware of public statements made by Prime Minister Modi in spring of this year where he said something to the effect of, today's India doesn't send dossiers to other countries to request assistance. Today's India will kill our enemies in their homes. Are you aware that that statement was made publicly by the Prime Minister?
That was a public statement that I am aware of. Maybe not in those exact words, but
sure,
as you say.
Something to that effect. So you spoke earlier about the geopolitical instability and context that we exist in right now and how it intersects with different foreign interference threats. So I think you would agree that the Modi government's autocratic behavior in terms of these specific violent acts that have been carried out over the past year or two is a threat not only to Canada's sovereignty and institutions, but a very real threat to the international rules-based order itself.
One of the reasons we have been so deeply engaged with our allies, particularly our Five Eyes allies of the United States, the UK, New Zealand, and Australia on this. We are a tight security partnership, us 5 countries, but also others, is because we are seeing right now around the world a pulling back of the rule of law, contesting of the international rules-based order. Whether it be Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, whether it be China's coercive diplomacy, as evidenced by the arresting of the arbitrary detention of 2 Michaels. Ensuring that amongst our community of nations, particularly democracies, that purport to be and aspire to be rule of law countries, that we be there to highlight and stand strongly against violations of international law is really important. So this is something that we have highlighted to allies, and is something that many countries around the world share, of concerns that if we don't have the rule of law and the international rules-based order at this particular complex moment in global history, then everyone becomes less safe, and everyone is poised to suffer either economically or worse.
So that's a helpful kind of exposition on the rules-based order in general. The question was whether India's violent activities and attacks against Canada and Canadians, you would consider them a threat against the rules-based order and stability on the geopolitical stage, specifically with relation to these acts.
I think I have been very clear that Canada, as a country of the rule of law, will always stand up for the rules-based order, regardless of whether it is the arbitrary detention of 2 Michaels by China, or actions that that the RCMP highlighted earlier this week that involves India government engaging in facilitating violence in Canada against Canadians. This is something we will always take very seriously.
So a significant amount of attention in the government's communications this week focused on disrupting India's capabilities. But in the context of a sustained campaign of violence that lasted at least a year, I would suggest that accountability for those responsible is crucial to deterring this kind of violence. So my question is about what steps Canada can and will take to ensure that the senior officials who actually orchestrated and authorized this are held accountable. Will Canada apply targeted sanctions against RAW, India's intelligence agency, as well as those officials found to be responsible in an investigation in order to push India to cooperate?
The primary driver of the government's actions in this case, and in most, if not all cases, is ensuring the safety and security of Canadians. That is one of our top foreign policy goals, always. And we will continue to look at things we can do to ensure that Canadians are safe in Canada and when they travel overseas. Many of our foreign policy positions have flowed from that, and that will always be the lens with which we look at any possible future decisions. And I'm not going to hypothesize about what steps we might need to be taking to keep Canadians safe. What I can say is the steps that we have taken so far have been focused on ensuring greater safety for Canadians, ensuring our ability to keep Canadians safe by disrupting networks that were causing significant violence to Canadians.
So I don't think that really answered the question about accountability, but I'm going to move on.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
You mentioned Prime Minister Modi's comments to you in September 2023, urging Canada to arrest people who are outspoken against the Indian government. We've also heard evidence from CITE, from RCMP and Global Affairs that India seeks to influence Canadian policy to criminally prosecute Sikhs who advocate for Khalistan or otherwise criticize India. So yourself and the other witnesses have rightfully insisted that Canadian agencies already investigate any criminal activity, but that lawful political advocacy is protected by the Charter. So given that fact and that India engages in foreign interference with the objective of influencing Canadian policy in this regard, would you support suspending intelligence and information sharing agreements signed in 2018 that can be misused by the government of India to target Sikh activists engaging in lawful advocacy for Khalistan?
Let me be very clear once again. Canada's policy is around one India. We believe in the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of India. We respect that. We certainly expect India to respect the sovereignty of Canada, which in this case they have not. It is also extremely important that people who come to this country from every corner of the world understand that they are free to hold the political beliefs that they choose to when you're in Canada. We have a charter that protects people's freedoms, people's freedom of expression, people's freedoms of political views. And that is not just a foundational principle of free democracies all around the world, but it's particularly important for Canada, that is a country to which people have come from every corner of the world, in some cases choosing to leave their home country because of political disagreements or other reasons. So defending the rights of people to hold political views that may be unpopular in their home country is a foundational responsibility for any Canadian government.
So will you consider suspending those intelligence and information sharing agreements that can be misused by the government of India to target Sikh activists, particularly considering the evidence we've seen that India engages in foreign interference and disinformation for that objective?
As I've said a number of times, we are not looking to provoke or create a fight with India. The Indian government made a horrific mistake in thinking that they could interfere as aggressively as they did in the safety and sovereignty of Canada. And we need to respond in order to ensure Canadians' safety. What other steps we will take will be determined in due course, but every step of the way, our single overarching priority is ensuring that we are keeping all Canadians safe.
So we heard this week that 6 diplomats have been expelled from Canada and sent back to India. But given the long history of Indian foreign interference, the intensity we've observed and learned about through this commission, and the fact that this appears to be, in some form, a conscious policy decision by the government of India, I think it's reasonable that there's concerns that when new diplomats come to replace those ones, that there's concerns that they might continue to engage in similar kinds of activities. So looking back at India's foreign interference activities, which have clearly escalated, I want to look forward and ask you to provide some insight to the Commission, because I think it's fair to say that the Government of Canada and Canadian agencies failed to detect India's activities before they occurred, before the assassination of Bhai Hardeep Singh and this campaign of violence, and whatever steps have been taken failed to deter India from continuing to engage in violence against Canada and in Canada. So can you provide some insight on what lessons you think have been learned by the government and agencies that can actually inform how Canada increases its capacity to detect that kind of activity and actually effectively deters it in the future?
Well, first of all, let me say that the issue of the Indian government as a possible source of foreign interference is not something that only appeared over the past weeks or even over the past year. Canadian intelligence agencies have been collecting that information for a number of years now. And as I said in an earlier answer this morning, we are constantly adapting and adjusting to shifting approaches by other states as they engage through different technologies, through different means, through different vectors into advancing their aims in Canada. And we will continue to learn and adjust as necessary to do what we must do to keep Canadians safe, to protect our institutions.